I attended my brother's baby shower. His wife said, "The baby's moving. Touch it." I'm an obstetrician. I placed my hand and immediately pulled my wife aside. "Call an ambulance now," she asked. "Why didn't you feel the baby move?" "That's not." I collapsed as I heard my own words. I want to tell you about the 11 minutes between when I felt what I felt and when the paramedics arrived. My brother is named Augustus. My brother's wife is named Petra. Petra is 31. Petra had been pregnant for what we had all believed was 8 months. Petra had been showing in a way that was consistent with 8 months. Petra had been having a baby shower at her house on a Saturday afternoon. I am a physician. I had been a physician for 11 years. I had been a general internist who had spent the first 3 years of my career rotating through obstetrics during my residency. I had felt many pregnant abdomens during my training. I knew what fetal movement felt like. I knew what specific abnormalities felt like. Petra had said the baby was moving. Petra said, "Come feel." I had walked over. I had placed my hand on Petra's abdomen. The abdomen had been the wrong shape for an 8-month pregnancy. The abdomen had been distended in a way that was not consistent with a fetus. The abdomen had been hard in places it should have been soft. The abdomen had been pulsing in a way that suggested something else. I had pulled my hand back. I had pulled my wife Marin aside. Marin is also a physician. Marin is an emergency medicine physician. I whispered, "Call an ambulance now." Marin said, "Why?" I said, "That is not a baby. It is something else. It might be a mass. It might be an abdominal aortic aneurysm. I do not know, but it is not what she thinks." I had then collapsed against the wall. The collapsing had been brief. I had stood back up. Marin had called 911. The paramedics had arrived in about 11 minutes. The paramedics had assessed Petra. The paramedics had transported Petra to the hospital with my brother accompanying her. The hospital had done imaging. The imaging had revealed that Petra had a large abdominal mass. The mass was a tumor. The tumor was a teratoma that had been growing for years. The teratoma had become large enough to mimic a pregnancy in appearance. Petra had not been pregnant. Petra had been telling everyone she was pregnant for 8 months. Petra had been showing pregnancy tests. Petra had been showing ultrasound images. Petra had been doing all of the things a pregnant woman does. Petra had been doing them while not actually being pregnant. The hospital had brought in a psychiatrist. The psychiatrist had concluded that Petra had been experiencing something called pseudocyesis, combined with a delusional disorder. The pseudocyesis had been the false pregnancy. The hormones in her body had been responding to the delusion. Petra had surgery to remove the tumor. The tumor had been benign. Petra had been in psychiatric treatment for the past 8 months. Petra had been processing the fact that the baby she had been preparing for had never existed. The processing had been the worst grief I had ever witnessed because Petra had been grieving a child she had never been carrying. The weeks after the diagnosis were the worst kind of quiet. I did not call Augustus. I did not drive to his house. What I did was text Marin. I would text Marin and say, "Can you text Petra and see how she is doing?" I told myself I was giving Augustus space. Marin sat across from me at the kitchen table one night after I asked her to check in on Petra again, and she put her phone down and looked at me and said, "You are not giving him space. You are hiding." I did not say anything. I did not argue. The truth was, I was scared to look at my brother and see what my hands had done to his life. I replayed the moment at the shower constantly. The hardness. That is what I kept coming back to. The hardness in places where there should have been give, and the pulsing. The pulsing was not a baby kicking. The pulsing was vascular. In that moment, my brain had split into two people. There was the brother who wanted to be wrong. The brother who wanted to pull his hand away and smile and say, "Wow, that baby is really active." And then there was the doctor. The doctor who had spent 3 years in obstetrics rotations. The doctor won. The doctor always wins. And the brother has been paying for it ever since. That is the thing nobody tells you about being a physician in a family. Your training does not turn off when you walk through someone's front door. Then Kemi called. Kemi has been my closest friend since we were kids. Kemi called me on a Tuesday evening and said, "Augustus asked about you yesterday. He asked why you have not come by." I felt something loosen in my chest for the first time in weeks. Augustus was not angry. Augustus was wondering where I was. I drove to Augustus and Petra's house that evening. I parked on the street. I walked up to the front door. Augustus opened the door. The first thing I noticed was that Augustus looked thinner. He looked like a man who had been running on something other than food for a long time. Augustus looked at me and said, "I am glad you are here." I almost broke right there on his front step. We sat on the porch. Augustus talked about Petra's treatment. He talked about the psychiatrist she had been seeing. And then Augustus said something that I will never forget. He said, "Petra cried for 3 days straight when she finally understood there had never been a baby." His voice cracked just a little. I sat there and listened. The whole time I was listening, I could feel the guilt pressing on my chest. Because I was the reason Petra knew. I was the reason those 3 days of crying had happened. I knew, in my rational mind, that what I had done had saved Petra's life. But knowing you did the right thing and feeling like you did the right thing are two very different experiences. And then I heard a truck pulling into the driveway. Newton got out. Newton is our father. Newton walked up to the porch with his keys in his hand like he had done this 100 times before. Newton looked at me and said, "Oh, you are here." That was it. 3 words. Augustus's face changed when Newton said it. Augustus's face went from open to something else. Something guarded. Something that told me this was not a surprise visit. Newton had been coming here. Newton had been coming here regularly. Newton had been the one filling the space that I had left empty. Newton sat down without being invited. He just pulled up a chair and settled into it like the porch was his. And then he started talking. Newton said, "I spoke to the nurse at the facility yesterday. They said Petra is making progress, but they think the family needs to be more involved." He said it like he was the one in charge of Petra's care. Augustus nodded. Augustus just nodded. And that nod told me everything I needed to know. I could not sit there anymore. I stood up and said to Augustus, "Can I talk to you inside for a second?" We stood in the kitchen. The kitchen still had a calendar on the wall with a due date circled on it from months ago. Nobody had taken it down. I said, "Since when does Newton talk to Petra's treatment team?" Augustus said, "He has been helping. He has been here." I said, "He left when we were kids. He does not get to show up now and act like he is in charge of your wife's medical care." I said it with more heat than I meant to, and Augustus looked at me and said, "You were not here either." I do not know how to describe what that sentence did to me. It was not loud. He said it the way you say something that is just a fact. It landed somewhere in the center of my chest, and I had no response. hurts. I left that night. Then Kemi called again. Kemi did not waste time with small talk. Kemi said, I need to tell you something and you are not going to like it. Kemi said that Newton had been talking to people in our extended family. Newton had been telling them his version of what happened at the baby shower. Newton had been saying that I made a scene, that I diagnosed Petra in front of everyone like she was a patient and not a person. Kemi said, your aunt called me and asked if it was true that you embarrassed Petra in front of 30 people. I had to sit down. That was not what happened. I had not said a single word to Petra. I had pulled Marin aside. I had whispered to my own wife in a corner of the room. Newton was rewriting what happened. I picked up my phone and called Newton. Newton answered on the second ring. I said, you need to stop telling people I embarrassed Petra at the shower. That is not what happened. Newton's voice was calm. He said, I am telling people what Augustus told me. I said, Augustus was not even in the room when I spoke to Marin. There was a pause. Then Newton said, maybe you should ask yourself why your own brother does not remember it the way you do. And then Newton hung up. Marin sat with me that night. I told her everything. Marin listened to all of it. And then she said, Newton is not protecting Augustus. Newton is protecting his position. If you are the one who saved Petra's life, Newton has nothing. If you are the one who ruined the baby shower, Newton gets to be the hero who picked up the pieces. She said it like she had already figured this out days ago. I made a decision. I was done retreating. I was going to show up. I was going to stop letting Newton fill the space that belonged to me. I started showing up. I showed up the next day. I showed up the day after that. One evening I was sitting in the living room with Augustus and Petra. Augustus had gone to the kitchen. Petra and I were alone for a minute. She looked at me and said, I know you are the one who knew something was wrong. I know you are the reason I am alive. I could not speak for a few seconds. Petra said, Augustus told me. Augustus told me everything. I swallowed. I said, I am sorry it happened the way it did. Petra looked at me and her face was calm and sad and clear all at the same time, and she said, do not be sorry. Be here. 4 words. Do not be sorry. Be here. I kept coming over. It was starting to feel like something that could heal, and then Newton ruined it. I was there on a Thursday evening. Petra was having a good day. The front door opened. Newton walked in without knocking. He came into the living room and saw me sitting with Petra, and something crossed his face. Something quick. And then he smiled. He looked at Petra and said, I hope the doctor is not giving you medical advice again. Last time that happened, it did not go so well for you. Did it, Petra? Petra's face went blank. From the kitchen, Augustus said, Newton, that is enough. His voice was firm, but tired. Like this was not the first time he had said something like that. Newton held up his hands like he was being reasonable. He said, I am just saying, maybe we should let the professionals handle things instead of playing hero at family parties. I stood up. I said, you need to leave. Newton said, you do not get to tell me to leave my son's house. I looked at Augustus. Augustus said nothing. He just stood there. And that silence was the worst part. A few days later, I got a call from Armani. Armani is a family friend who works at the medical facility where Petra had been doing her inpatient treatment. She said, I need to tell you something about Newton. Newton called the facility. Newton called and told the staff that he was Petra's father-in-law and that he had medical power of attorney over her care. Newton had asked for details about Petra's psychiatric diagnosis, her treatment plan, her medication. Armani said, they did not give him anything because he is not on her forms, but he tried. Newton did not have power of attorney over Petra. Newton had lied to medical professionals to try to access his daughter-in-law's psychiatric records. I drove to Augustus's house. We sat at the kitchen table. I told him. Augustus said, he told me he was just checking in on her. I said, he told the facility he had power of attorney over your wife. He lied to medical professionals to access her psychiatric records. Augustus put his hands over his face. He stayed like that for a long time. Then he said, still behind his hands, I have been letting him in because I thought he was finally being a father. I said, he is not being a father. He is being what he has always been. He is being the person who shows up when there is a role to play and disappears when the work gets hard. Augustus took his hands away from his face. His eyes were red. He looked at me and said, what do we do? I said, we talk to Newton together and we tell him the truth about what he is doing and why it needs to stop. Augustus nodded. He said, okay. Saturday came. Augustus's living room. Newton knocked once and walked in before anyone answered. He sat down in the chair across from us. He looked at me. He looked at Augustus. He said, what is this? An intervention? I did not ease into it. I said, you called Petra's treatment facility and told them you had medical power of attorney. You do not. Newton sat there for a second, his jaw working, and then he said, someone needed to make sure she was being taken care of properly. Augustus said, I am taking care of her. She is my wife. His voice was steady in a way I had not heard from him in months. Newton looked at Augustus and then pointed at me and said, and where was your brother when you needed help? He disappeared for weeks. I was the one who was here. I let that land. And then I said, I made a mistake by staying away. I thought I was giving Augustus space. I was wrong. But you did not fill that space to help Augustus. You filled it to feel important. You filled it because this is the first time in 30 years either of us has needed you, and you did not want to miss the chance to pretend you have been here all along. Newton's face tightened. He leaned forward in the chair and said, you do not get to talk to me like that. I am your father. I said, you are the man who left when I was 9 and Augustus was 7. You showed up for holidays and sent checks. That is not the same thing. Newton turned to Augustus. He said, are you going to let him talk to me like this? Augustus did not answer right away. The silence lasted long enough that I could hear the clock in the kitchen. Then Augustus said, he is not wrong, Newton. Something in Newton's face changed. The control slipped. Augustus kept going. He said, you told the family that my brother embarrassed Petra at the shower. He did not. He saved her life. You told people he made a scene. He whispered to his wife to call 911. You rewrote what happened so you could be the one who looked good. Newton shook his head. He said, that is not what I was doing. Augustus said, then what were you doing? Newton did not answer. The room was quiet for a long time. And then Newton did something I did not expect. His eyes filled with tears, the kind that come when something inside you finally breaks open. Newton said, I was terrified. I was terrified that you were both going to go through this and I was going to be on the outside again. I was terrified that your brother was going to be the one you leaned on and I was going to be nothing. I have been nothing to both of you for years and I earned that. I know I earned that. But when Petra got sick, I thought maybe this was my chance to be something and I did it wrong. I did it wrong because I do not know how to do it right. I never learned. I looked looked at this man sitting in my brother's chair with tears running down his face, and for the first time in my life I did not see a villain. I saw a man who missed his own life and had been trying to paste himself back into it with the wrong glue. I said, "You do not get to lie about what I did. You do not get to call Petra's doctors. You do not get to rewrite this family's history to give yourself a better role. If you want to be here, you have to be here as who you actually are, not who you wish you had been." Newton nodded. It was a small nod. He said, "I do not know if I know how to do that." Augustus looked at him. Augustus's voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of every year he had spent growing up in a house without this man in it. Augustus said, "Then learn. We learned how to grow up without you. You can learn how to show up without performing." The months that followed were not easy. Newton did not transform overnight, but Newton also started calling before he came over. Newton also started asking instead of telling. Newton also, for the first time, sat in a room with both his sons and said nothing when there was nothing useful to say. Petra continued her recovery. Petra had good days and terrible days. Petra told me during one visit, "I still sometimes put my hand on my stomach and wait, and then I remember." And the remembering is the hardest part. I held her hand and did not say anything because there was nothing a physician or a brother-in-law could say that would fix that. Augustus and I talk on the phone every week now. We talk about things we never talked about before. Augustus said during one of those calls, "You know what I think about the most? I think about those 11 minutes between when you felt what you felt and when the paramedics arrived. I think about what you must have been carrying in those 11 minutes. And I think about the fact that you carried it so I did not have to. And I will never forget that. I do not describe myself as a hero. I describe myself as a man who touched his sister-in-law's stomach at a baby shower and felt the wrong thing and had to decide in 1 second what to do with that information. I chose the truth. The truth broke something. The truth also saved someone. I have made peace with the fact that those two things can be true at the same time."